Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Democratic Constitution podcast. I'm really excited today to be talking to Dan Farbman, and we're going to get into Dan's work, a lot of which discusses contemporary events compared to the 1850s. We'll talk about resistance lawyering, for example. Lots of topics.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
First, if you could introduce yourself and explain how you became interested in law, first off, and also studying the American abolitionist movement.
Great. So I'm Dan Farbman. I'm a professor of law at Boston College Law School. My story about how I got interested in these topics sort of goes back a long way, but I'll start just back at right after law school. I had a fellowship working at a place called Advancement Project, where I was doing work with grassroots base building community organizations that were engaged in sort of long-term movements for structural change, for changing the way power operates. And I was working mostly on issues of racial justice in public schools. And so that was what I was doing after as a lawyer. I really believed in the work. And then for, reasons that anybody who's gone into the academy will understand, I decided to pivot and become a law professor, which meant actually going to graduate school first for me. So I went to graduate school and I studied American studies, American history, American literature. And I didn't initially know what I was going to focus on, but as I started to do the reading and the work I was doing, I realized I was drawn to the middle of the 19th century and the abolitionist movement. And in part because I was drawn to the problem or the question of abolitionist lawyers and how they dealt with what is basically a problem, which is that they had become politically radicalized by the abolitionist movement. They'd become anti-slavery. They'd become to believe that slavery needed to be abolished, while also remaining lawyers within a system that was, at the time, in the first half of the 19th century, essentially committed to a compromise that upheld the system of slavery. And so this sort of friction between their political identity and their newfound political radicalism and the system that they operated within became really interesting to me. And so that became the center of what I consider to be my academic project, understanding how these lawyers navigated those problems and those conflicts and those contradictions, and also thinking about the ways in which understanding that helps us understand the way that lawyers operate in the present and the way that lawyers' professional roles and their politics intersect and don't intersect. So that's what led me to the kinds of work that I do. And I also teach in law school at Boston College. I teach courses on constitutional law, as well as local government law, as well as movement lawyering and some other things. And so my academic interests, the things I write, have intersected with the things I teach, which I think creates the context for our conversation today in lots of ways.
One thing that stands out about your work is, just as you said, how you explore that space or that experience of working within a particular system that people might be averse to, while also trying to use what's available to further goals of social justice and so on and so forth. I wanted to touch on your article. It's called Outrage and Resistance, one of your articles. Outrage and Resistance, Abolitionist Lessons for the Present Crisis, which was the first work of yours that I read. It was published on the Labor and Political Economy blog. And you write that as a historian of the 1850s, much of Trump's first 4 months in office is depressingly familiar. And so I was curious what parallels you see between today and the 1850s. And I'll say in the article there are various cases that you mentioned. For example, the case of Horace Preston in 1852, other cases involving fugitive slaves and abolitionist interaction.
Great. Yeah. So I think the best way of answering that is to answer it in three parts, sort of going from general to specific. I mean, the shortest version of the answer, the sort of TLDR version of this, is there are a striking number of similarities between what we're witnessing in the present and the political chaos of the 1850s. Given the things that I study, it's not good for my work to be relevant, but it is distressing how relevant it feels. So let me just break that down into three sort of buckets, and then we can work on any of those that you'd like to talk more about. The first is to note that there's a big thing happening right now, which was similar to the thing that was happening in the 1850s, and I would refer to that as something like a breakdown of a pre-existing, relatively stable legal, social, political order. So, in the 1850s, basically from 1800 or so, let's use that as a date, although we could even go back to 1787 and the first Constitution. There had been a kind of unstable but relatively steady détente that some people talk about as the early republic, where an unstable compromise had been reached between North and South over issues that included slavery but had to do with all kinds of other things, including who got to vote and including how national infrastructure would be built. And the whole political system and the whole legal system had sort of been built on that, as I said, unsteady but somewhat stable set of compromises. One way of thinking about it is if you know anything about the way that states were formed out of the territories before the Civil War, there was something called the Missouri Compromise, and they'd drawn a line basically geographically across the middle of the country, and they said any states north of this line will enter the Union as free states, and any states south of the line will enter the states as states where slavery is legal. So the basic underpinning of this compromise had been, among other things, as I say, a compromise that basically preserved the legality of slavery. In the 1850s, that compromise starts to break down for a number of reasons, and we can get into some of them. But in breaking down, what happens is the whole constitutional order, what had seemed stable, what it's everything as it fit together in its sort of very delicate ways, was starting to unravel. And so things that had seemed previously settled now seemed less settled. Ways of understanding how politics worked, or how to understand the Supreme Court, or how political parties worked, were all breaking down. The original two parties were realigning at this moment. And so I think we're actually seeing something quite similar to that in the present, right? We had a long mid-century stability in the United States. You might locate it back in the New Deal. You might locate it in the 1960s. There's lots of people who've talked about it in lots of different ways. But one thing that I think is true is that in the first decades of the 21st century, that stability has started to break down along lots of vectors for lots of reasons. And I think we're feeling a similar set of instability, anxieties, uncertainty about how our politics is organized. Right. So I think there's a similarity there, sort of structural, underlying, vibes based similarity that we could talk about. So that's one most general. Then we take a second piece of this, which is another set of similarities, that in that moment of instability in the 1850s, one of the things that emerged was a sort of new militant, reactionary, white supremacist based Southern politics, which essentially was demanding, in the absence of the old compromise, was demanding a more explicit set of concessions to slavery and the white supremacist politics behind slavery. Now, it's actually more complicated than that, because in some ways, white supremacy emerges in the 1850s and in the form that we recognize it now through this sort of new reactionary way of talking about slavery. You start seeing explicit endorsements of slavery as being positively good, as opposed to just being a peculiar institution that was something that we just have. You start seeing theological defense of slavery. You start seeing, interestingly, critiques of the Declaration of Independence as being bad and wrong, immoral, because of its commitments to equality. You have this sort of rising tide. I wouldn't say that it's the first iteration of this. I think there's something that's been true in American politics sort of for a long time, and we can talk more about that if you'd like. But you have this, in response to this political instability, in response to this sort of breakdown of the old system, you have a rising tide of reactionary, explicitly white supremacist politics. And that in that rising tide, what you see is things happening in the name of that politics, which are brutal and horrifying. Brutal and horrifying. I'm not saying that in retrospect. I'm saying brutal and horrifying to the people witnessing them. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. I think the parallels to the present are similar, right? In these moments of political instability, when things feel up for grabs, you're going to see forces coming that come from all edges of the political spectrum. And right now we have a a very vocal and powerful reactionary right wing set of arguments being made in this political instability, and many of which are motivated by oftentimes explicit white supremacist premises, certainly nativist premises. That's not new in American politics. I think it would be a mistake to think of it as new. It is, however, sort of, as I say, depressingly familiar, that political dynamic. I'll just sort of add, sort of parenthetically, is that there are all of these moments, if you're paying attention, where the parallels are just striking. So, for instance, I think yesterday Speaker Johnson suggested that Gavin Newsom be tarred and feathered, right? Which is precisely what Southern supporters of slavery did to abolitionists who dared to come south and proclaim abolitionism on the streets of southern cities, right? So it's rhetorical, it's symbolic. There's a real feeling in which this is the same kind of politics emerging, right? Now just to be most specific, and we can pivot to the specific case of Horace Preston if you want. One of the ways in which this manifested in the 1850s was with the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, infamous law in American history, passed as part of what people call the Compromise of 1850, although a lot of people, scholars including myself, are not quite so sure what the North gave up in the compromise, but it was a compromise between North and South theoretically, or what the North got in the compromise, I should say. We can get into the details of precisely what the compromise said, but the Fugitive Slave Law itself was something that the Southerners had demanded to make it easier for people who claimed ownership in other human beings to reclaim those human beings using federal courts. So what the previously, the whole process had been, although it had been sort of structured by federal law, it had been not a federal process. After the Fugitive Slave Law, there were officially federal commissioners who were judicial officers who adjudicated claims. If a southern person, if a southern plantation owner claimed ownership in another human, they would go before the federal commissioner, and the federal commissioner would adjudicate those claims. Now, and the process was absurdly tilted against the person who was being alleged to be a slave. They could really not present evidence. Maybe the most absurd version of this is that the commissioner got paid twice the amount for finding that the person should be re-enslaved than they would if they found the person wasn't going to be enslaved. And the law also made it a crime for abolitionists, white northern abolitionists, or any northern abolitionists, to interfere with the process of the Fugitive Slave Law. Oh, and I should add, it also created the possibility to create a federal police force to help go and catch people who were alleged to be slaves. So this law comes into effect as a part of a thing that the South demands to remain within the Union, to remain within the compromise. And it's an outrage to people as they watch it play out, because you're watching your neighbors, people who've been living in your community, be brought before these extremely summary process courts, and with almost no process offered to them, and then be enslaved and disappear into, by the way, lives of forced labor, where it was basically impossible to retrieve them from in some cases. That's the phrase "sold down the river." The idea was you'd go so far into the deep South, Mississippi or Alabama, it would be impossible to find you. And that was happening under the Fugitive Slave Law. So this was an outrage. People watched this happening in their communities. It was an outrage to them. And that's again, I think what I'd say is, if you're asking what's depressingly familiar about the present, is a similar federal process being put into place that is explicitly premised on the idea that some people don't deserve due process, and some people are less than human or less deserving of rights or process than other people are. And people are watching that happen. They're watching it play out in their communities, and it is creating, in the same way, it's creating outrage, because it's an explicit invocation of this kind of, as I say, reactionary politics, which then creates a kind of public set of acts that are outrageous to some people.
Let's linger for a sec, maybe on the fugitive slave law.
I think there's a couple moments of galvanization around the Fugitive Slave Law. I think one thing that's important to realize is that it didn't come out of nowhere. One of the reasons why the South was so intent on passing this new Fugitive Slave Law was because northern states in the 1840s, with sort of a rise of anti-slavery politics across the North, had started to impose what we've come to call personal liberty laws. So these personal liberty laws were essentially state guarantees of process. So if you were a person who claimed ownership in another human being and you came to New York and said, this person, I should be able to re-enslave this person because I own them. New York, under its personal liberty law, would say, oh, okay, but you have to prove that you actually have this property right in this person. You have to say more than just claim it. And those laws, so those laws were not, they didn't say it's illegal to own other human beings. They simply imposed a state due process requirement before you could re-enslave somebody. And Southerners found this to be a huge imposition on what they called their sacred property rights. And so there's a case from the 1840s called Prigg versus Pennsylvania, where they essentially challenge these personal liberty laws as unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court says, absolutely, they're unconstitutional. You have the right to go and kidnap people. The facts of that case are horrific. A woman named Margaret Morgan was possibly not actually legally someone who should have been enslaved, and her children were almost certainly not. And yet she was kidnapped along with her children and brought into slavery, and the Supreme Court said that's fine. Because the personal liberty laws that would have protected her are unconstitutional. So that's the backdrop to why this law was passed, essentially demanding that these state protections of due process be bypassed so we'd have a federal process. So the first moment when the law is passed is an outrage to a number of people who are paying attention. R.J.M. Blackett has a great book about this. It talks about the first months after the law is being passed. There's outrage everywhere. In 1850, 1851, I wrote an article about how actually some local town meetings and town halls passed basically ordinances saying this law is an outrage. So there was a moment of outrage at the first moment, and a lot of political galvanization that happened at that time. But when the real galvanization happened when the cases started coming up in local communities. So I'll give you two examples. One is the example that I wrote about in the blog post, that the LPE blog post that you talked about, which is this example of Horace Preston, who was a man living in New York with his family in 1852. He had left Baltimore, where he had been enslaved, and come to New York, and had a wife and children who was working in New York. The person who claimed ownership in him found out that he was living in New York and basically had a connection in the New York Police Department. And so they went to Preston's workplace and they arrested him on false charges. He hadn't done anything wrong. If this sounds familiar, that's not surprising. So he was arrested basically on false charges and brought to the jail in New York City. It was called the Tombs. And the guy who claimed to own him came north to New York, and they tried to bring him before the federal commissioner as fast as possible to avoid anybody finding out that this was happening. They wanted to get him back to Baltimore and re-enslave him as quickly as possible. Now, just before the commissioner is able to make his decision, and remember that there was no right to counsel under the Fugitive Slave Law, so they could get him there without lawyers, and they could get their answer, or they'd be out of there. So, but just before that happens, the abolitionists find out this is happening, and two abolitionist lawyers come and represent Preston. And what winds up happening is they create delay. And so Preston was about to be sent to Baltimore, and he is actually, through the lawyers' sort of creative litigation strategies, which I'm happy to talk more about, 2 days of delay happen, and he is kept in New York. Although ultimately, at the end, after those 2 days, he is still found by the commissioner to be properly a slave. So he's re-enslaved by order of the federal government and brought back to Baltimore. That's not the end of the story, right? So the two abolitionist lawyers have created this political space by creating delay. And after this decision, which they find out, which they claim is outrageous, they argue rightly that the whole thing had been based on these trumped up criminal charges, that it never should have happened in the first place. They wind up being able to gather enough support in the community to gather the money they need to purchase Preston's freedom. And so in a few months later, Preston is returned to New York, and as a free man, because his freedom has been purchased by the sort of abolitionist community in New York. So that has a short-term and a long-term political outcome, right? So the short-term political outcome is Preston is actually redeemed from having to be enslaved for the rest of his life. And the long-term political outcome is this is a huge organizing opportunity for the abolitionist community in New York to see this outrage happening on their streets. And it converts a number of people to a kind of more radicalized politics. The most famous version of this, and you can tell me if you don't want me to talk this long about it, is the Anthony Burns case, which happens in Boston a couple of years later in 1854. Anthony Burns is another man, actually also who had been enslaved in the South and had come to Boston and was working in Boston and was basically kidnapped off the streets in Boston and brought before the federal commissioner in Boston. There was a huge uprising trying to rescue him, and one of the officers guarding him was killed in a rescue attempt. And the federal government became so committed to making sure that this law was enforced in this instance that they sent federal troops in to guard him as he walked through the streets. So Burns is, after the commissioner finds that he should be re-enslaved, Burns is marched through the streets of Boston at gunpoint into a waiting ship. He ultimately also has his freedom repurchased, so he doesn't remain enslaved for the rest of his life. But this moment inflames Massachusetts. So people who'd previously been sort of nominally anti-slavery or nominally opposed to the way things were going became quite militant. The most famous of these is Henry David Thoreau, who writes this essay called Slavery in Massachusetts, but also Walt Whitman. There's an explosion of political agitation and anger around this moment when the actual brutality of the regime that's being imposed comes home, when you see it in your streets. Right. So I do think it's right that it backfired, but it didn't backfire as a sort of abstraction. It backfired in the actual doing of it. Once you start pulling people off the streets and sending them away for the rest of their lives to basically be punished, people have different reactions to that than they would as just to the abstraction of, should people be able to own slaves? That's a different question than, should Anthony Burns be marched through the streets of Boston at federal gunpoint? Those have different political valences and are different kinds of political moments.
Well, as we're talking, I'm thinking about contemporary examples, of course, of people being taken off the streets. I think what I'll do is continue moving us through your article, some of your other articles, the ideas you present, and then towards the end, we'll touch on contemporary examples, particularly in Los Angeles, so on. I wanted to ask you about an Audre Lorde quote that you use in your article. It's a well-known one, that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So I was curious if you can explore what it means for people within an institution to criticize or resist that institution. You touched there a little bit, I think, on some lessons from the abolitionist movement, people using the process to sort of gum up the works, delay, so on and so forth. But this is an important aspect of your work, people within the system encountering things that go against their values while working within that system.
Sure. It's a famous quote, I think sometimes oversimplified in the way that people understand it. She was talking in the context that she was talking about. She was actually talking about academia, which is a whole other set of conversations. But yeah, so I think there is, especially in moments of political exigency or sort of heightened political conflict, and in all contexts of social movements, there's always been this sort of push and pull between how pure we should keep the movement, how pure things should be, or how pragmatic we should be. And so one of the ways in which the Lorde quote is sometimes used is as a kind of call to purity. If the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, the argument is you can't change things by using the institutions that already exist. You have to build something new. I think the trouble with that as an interpretation of it, honestly, is that it demands everything before you have anything. And it suggests, I think, somewhat counterfactually, that any of us are somehow institutional outsiders who could build an entirely outsider set of responses to the institutions that we live in. I just don't think that describes the world we live in. I think most everybody is an insider in some way, shape, or form. And if that's true, if we all are somehow embedded in some kinds of institutions that are related in some way to the system that we operate within, then we need to think about what it means to be within those systems and to be opportunistically opposed to things that happen within those systems without demanding that we exit the systems altogether. Because I think that there's a kind of fantasy that we could somehow find our exit all the way and then be able to attack from the outside the systems that we don't want. So the way that I've thought about this, and you're referring to an article I wrote called "A Commons in the Master's House," is to sort of begin with the premise that actually we are all institutional insiders of some way, shape, or form, and that in that context, we actually are always, every day, subject to choices about how we use our power or our positions within those institutions to either sustain those institutions, to do gatekeeping, to do sort of status quo policing, or how we might use those positions to open up possibilities within those institutions to imagine the world differently than it is, right? So, an example of this might be, I'm a law professor, right? So I can, in the context of being a law professor, say, well, only certain kinds of articles should be published. And I could be a voice saying, only allow people with certain kinds of credentials or certain kind of voices to speak. Or when I have the opportunity, I can say, well, I'm interested in hearing other voices that maybe aren't the voices I hear all the time. I'm interested in inviting other kinds of conversations into the spaces that might otherwise not normally hear those conversations. And so, in the article you're talking about, I'd call this a kind of radical pragmatism. Are there ways in which we can, day by day, in a kind of incremental way, invite the spaces that we already occupy to become more inclusive, to become more porous, so voices from outside find their ways in? And so we actually change the systems, not in a sort of utopian way necessarily, but I mean this in a very sort of everyday incremental way. What kind of choices can we make as we move through our lives within these institutions to make those institutions more inclusive or include the kinds of questions that would allow the institutions to change? And I don't mean to say that the institutions shouldn't be dismantled altogether. Some of them maybe should be. I do mean to say that I think when we think about the question of how we operate within institutions, it's almost too facile to say, well, the institution is bad and therefore we should reject it. Because in fact, most of us are embedded within institutions where we might have real critiques about whether we like them or not. And this connects to the abolitionist lawyers, by the way. In the article, maybe that sort of you're referring to by proxy, which is called resistance lawyering, I write about how these abolitionist lawyers used a system that they explicitly despised, which was the procedural backdrop of the fugitive slave law, to try to frustrate the underlying aims of the fugitive slave law. Now, they would say in court the fugitive slave law is unconstitutional, and then they would use all of the tools that were available to them, the limited tools that were available to them within this system, to try to slow things down, to try to build other ways of thinking about how the law might operate on people. And they were, as I argue in that article, way more successful than you might expect them to be in actually protecting people from being enslaved by using the tools that were available to them, not by necessarily endorsing them, but also not by rejecting them, right? By saying this, what is before us, what can be done, and how can we do it in a way that actually is in service of a longer term goal of building systems and institutions we like better. So in the sort of present abolitionist context, this is referred to as non-reformist reforms. What are the kinds of things that can be done that don't necessarily reinscribe all the logic of an institution, which we might have critiques of, but that also we can do, that don't require the institutions to disappear altogether before we can do anything?
Well, I'm thinking one critique of the existing political system, the two parties that we have, though I'll focus, I suppose, mostly on the Democratic Party, is to the extent the politicians are accountable to people, accountable to their base, accountable to their constituency, for example. And so in some of the political spaces that I inhabit, there's a real emphasis on, okay, if we endorse this person, we endorse their candidacy or, their attempt to get a particular position, we want to have some mechanism in which we know that they're going to toe the line in a certain sense. That's perhaps a rather direct way of putting it, but we want to know that this person is not going to get into a position of power and just represent themselves and just say whatever they want, that they're attached to a particular base, if you will. So there's a quote by a Students for a Democratic Society member, Carl Oglesby, I believe in 1965, in an article of his, Trapped in a System, to paraphrase, basically says that our allies in government, if they are our allies, don't need advice or study groups, but they need constituencies and movements. And so I thought about this idea in terms of fighting the system in regards to the Constitution. And for example, I've criticized Bernie Sanders for not pointing out how the Senate makes many of the very important policies that he advocates very difficult, all but impossible. And so I wish that there was a senator who would use their position to stand up and say, this particular system we have is anti-democratic, and it's an abomination. Who knows what they would want to say. But yet that seems like just a fantasy that someone in that position would basically attack the very ground that they are standing on, in a certain sense. Which one tension I see in talking about people who have a certain amount of privilege or a certain amount of power in their position, leveling a critique on that position. What if you're basically tearing down the floor that you're standing on? So I saw some parallels there between your work on resistance lawyering. And so I was curious if you feel that there are limits to resistance, or if there's also an element of internal resistance requiring external movements.
Yeah. It's a rich question. Well, let me say two things. One sort of parenthetically, I think, which connects to something I was saying earlier, just about the Senate. There are two parts of two enactments in the 1787 Constitution, two parts of that the convention made unamendable. They wrote it into the Constitution. You may not amend this. I mean, of course, that's a silly thing to write, because you could amend the part of the Constitution that makes it unamendable, and then you could amend it so it's not actually unamendable. But they made it especially difficult to amend two things. One was the protection of the foreign slave trade for 20 years until 1808. So basically, the Southerners said, we won't sign on to this unless you protect our ability to bring enslaved people from Africa and from elsewhere in the world to the United States to build up the population of enslaved people for the next 20 years. So nobody thought this was a moral good idea. It was totally an exigent compromise made with the South to get their votes. The other thing they made unamendable was the Senate, which was similarly nobody thought was a good idea as a matter of democratic political theory. It was a hostage demand by the small states, basically demanding we're not going to sign on to this unless we're guaranteed equal representation in this body with the large states. Now, at the time, the inequalities were much smaller than they are now between Wyoming and California. Wyoming has 2 senators and California has 2 senators. The idea that somehow has anything to do with individual representation is insane. The Senate, just important to recognize, the Senate, sometimes people talk about it as this great institution of American democracy. And in fact, it was a compromise made in order to get the Constitution over the line. And if you really believed in something like having a larger, slower, more deliberate body, there's ways of doing it without insisting that Wyoming have a much larger voice in American politics than California does. So we can talk more about the Senate and whether it's problematic. Happy to do that, but wanted to just sort of put that on the table. The broader point, though, is that, if you've got an institution like the Senate and you say, well, I want to change it, what's necessary to do that? Now, it might be great to create a political movement and elect people to the Senate who were critics of the Senate from the inside. And I can actually imagine that happening in the not too distant future, that critique has become a much more salient critique in our politics over the last 10 years than it has been previously. And this is sort of just anecdotal, but in my law school classes, I see that critique much more at the top of people's minds than it had been, just 8 years ago when I started teaching. So I do think that there is that might change over time. But the broader point is that I think even your point about wanting to be able to make sure that the people you endorse and elect are beholden to you, I think is a little bit reverses the politics of what we're talking about here. In order to make people beholden to you, you need to build a politics that people are beholden to, right? You need to build political power, and you need to build a political movement, or a set of political compromises, or even a set of political coalitions that people feel beholden to. Now, there are ways in which our structural system makes it harder to hold people accountable than it would in other contexts. But I also think that it's very easy to see the way in which politicians do remain quite accountable to strong political messages. I think if you can just look at someone like Gavin Newsom and the way he responds to events on the ground and the way that his political rhetoric changes when those events on the ground change, right? These people are not actually immune from the kinds of pressures that can be brought to bear by politics. And I think sometimes when we think that the problem is that institutional insiders are insufficiently beholden to us, sometimes we skip over the part where we make ourselves impossible to not be beholden to, right? Um, and that actually, this is sort of the longer story of like an anti-slavery politics as well. Anti-slavery politics, the building of an anti-slavery politics that wound up in the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. By the way, it wasn't an abolitionist, but he was opposed to slavery. And that just, if you want to talk about that distinction, we can, but it matters. That was a project that happened over a long period of time, where people built coalitions and tried new parties and tried joining old parties and built political will at the local level and built political will in response to things happening in their communities, right? It's a slow, long work, and it requires a kind of focus on the project itself, which is what I sort of mean by this idea of pragmatism, right? That you're not, yes, the institutions that we might critique are not going to change when we snap our fingers. They change when we do the work to build the political will to make sure that those institutions change, right? And that's slow, extremely long-term work. And sometimes wouldn't, you might even call it radical, because it sometimes is really incremental. It's sometimes about making choices in the time at the present. So not to totally rehabilitate Bernie, to a long way of coming back around to Bernie Sanders, not to totally rehabilitate him, but if you want to think about where the willingness to create institutions like the Senate, to critique institutions like the Senate has come from, well, I'm not sure that I wouldn't give some of the credit to Bernie Sanders and his movement, and I wouldn't call it his movement, and the way in which he's made space for certain kinds of voices within our political process to speak in ways they maybe wouldn't have spoken before. And so to the extent that we are going to get, so maybe Bernie Sanders himself will not be the critic of the institution that you want him to be. But you might ask a question: has Bernie Sanders created more space within the political process for people to say things that might go a further way toward critiquing institutions that you have critiques of? Well, I think actually the answer to that might be yes, that he has actually done that. That's both a matter of process and a matter of substance. But I think in some ways the process of making space for people to speak and giving platforms to people who maybe wouldn't have had platforms otherwise does really matter in these instances. And part of what I'm sort of arguing here for is that when you want to do this kind of transformational political work, the lessons from my work historically is that you have to be patient, is that patience is almost the only virtue. Patience and pragmatism are, you need to do them at the same time, because impatience leads to a kind of fatalism, I think. And so I think that is an important lesson for the present, I would say also. I'd also just add to that, I think one, and this is another important piece of sort of that cuts across a lot of my work, is to make distinctions between substantive policy outcomes and ways of reimagining political process. So I think one of the things that I do think has been a valuable, lasting impact of, whether you want to call it the Bernie movement or the global sort of 2014, 2015 movement, is a real commitment to a different and more thick kind of participatory democracy. Now, did that last? Has it been lasting? Complicated question, in some places more than others, right? But I do think that one of the things that Bernie represents is that. And that actually is another really important piece of the sort of broader movement story. I think oftentimes people think about movements as having specific policy goals, but a lot of the people that I worked with were really interested in building power, right? And that wasn't so much about building power to do something. It was rather building the power so that people could be politically engaged who hadn't previously been politically engaged or empowered, right? And so if the argument is that we need to build the mechanisms for empowerment, for political engagement, for political participation, that's a separate set of questions that isn't actually about, are we getting the kinds of things we want policy-wise, from the people that we're looking for. And I think that actually really is so that's a lesson from the past, that abolitionists really were trying to include a different set of voices in their in the organizing, such that although Black people were not allowed to vote in the United States in most places during this time, and increasingly by the 1850s almost in no places, there was a lot of political engagement from both enslaved and free Black people within the abolitionist community that was helping drive that political process, helping drive the sort of political imaginations and understandings that really mattered when it came to the sort of the election of Lincoln and then Reconstruction. Those voices were a big part of, they were included in the broader project in ways that they wouldn't have been absent that sort of process change and process inclusion that was part of what was going on in the movement. And I think you can see that now in lots of ways too. The way in which people are talking about, we need to protect certain kinds of democratic values. Those are in many ways process values as opposed to policy values. And you're getting strange bedfellows across the political spectrum of people committed to certain kinds of process values that you wouldn't otherwise have necessarily had. And actually, it's important to say, look, that's actually something that's a politics too. It's not just about we should have universal health care. It's about we should talk to each other in certain ways and be politically engaged with each other in certain ways as opposed to other ways.
It's making me think of some critiques that I hear, even if just a little tangentially, around talking about the need for a democratic political system or a democratic constitution, and putting aside perhaps whether or not, there's agreement around, well, yes, we absolutely need a democratic political system. Two questions sometimes pop into people's minds. One, well, but if we don't know what people are going to do with that democracy, then is this really the right time to talk about getting it? That's one. And then the other is, well, this talk around the political system and the Constitution, it's too abstract for most people. There's the invocation usually, I think, of sort of an average worker and the average working class person. It's too abstract. This is not what the average working class person thinks about. And therefore, your politics would be better off focusing on what the average working class person thinks about. Now, there's a lot of assumptions in that one in particular around what is this average person, what's the average thing they're thinking about, so on and so forth. But the critique usually serves as a way of saying, don't talk about this particular issue, or it's just not politically useful to talk about this particular issue. And I suppose the other one around, well, what's the democracy going to be used for, so on and so forth, that one particularly frustrates me. But I think it's also used as a way to sort of dampen down or poke holes in the demand in the present of, we don't have democracy, we need democracy. Are there parallels between that and some of the things you've been talking about?
I think there are. I mean, certainly things that I talk about, certainly in my classes and sometimes in my work. I mean, I think one of the big questions is, whenever you're using the term democracy, you are in a mess, because democracy means many different things to many different people. And I'm not actually sure how productive it is to police the meaning of democracy in one way or another. I mean, some of us have substantive moral / intuitional / political commitments to certain ideas of democracy. And others of us have different kinds of commitments, I'm not sure that Mike Lee would say that he doesn't believe in democracy, but he does think that the republic is not a democracy. And Senator Mike Lee from Utah, James Madison, for instance, who is frequently seen as he was basically the main author of the Constitution, super skeptical of mass democracy, right? And the Constitution was written in large part to avoid what he saw to be the excesses of mass democracy. So, but he also believed in democracy, right? If you read the Federalist Papers, doesn't reject the idea of democracy out of hand, but he's worried about some kinds of democracy, right? So we just have to be careful about what we mean by democracy. And so, in my way of thinking about it and responding to this, to me, my answer is not so much that we should or shouldn't be talking about democracy, but rather that most people, I do think, have some commitment. Maybe this is my own assumption about the average working person, but I think that most people would say they have some commitment to self-government, right? Some commitment to having a stake in the decisions that are made in their name and with their money, right? And when we begin there, I think there is actually more. So you could say this, well, this is why we have to talk about kitchen table issues, because I am sympathetic to the idea that local conversations about local decisions actually are rich in this, because if you can get kinds of agreement over where the stoplight should be located that you wouldn't get over national questions of political policy. But I also think that there's a broader point, which is that people do want to be involved in lots of ways. People don't want to simply be cut out of all decisions. And so if that's true, if there is this kind of general intuitional commitment, and maybe this is fraying, and maybe this is part of what we're seeing in the public sphere right now, but I actually think there remains a broad agreement on something like this. That the question is then, how do you build from there? How do you build a conversation about what we do together from that premise? Not from some abstract theory of the Constitution as being a totem of democracy. You know, my colleague down the hall, Aziz Rana, has written incredibly, I don't know, he's been on your podcast, has written incredibly thoughtfully about whether the Constitution it's actually itself should be understood as some sort of totem of democracy, some sort of holder of democratic values, or whether maybe the values we can hold outside of or parallel to, or maybe sometimes even in contrast to, constitutional values. But I do think that that would be where I would want to talk about it. And I think that's partly what the story is that you saw, to bring it back to the fugitive slave law. This is a story you saw people telling themselves in Massachusetts, people saying, well, this is an abstraction. The question of slavery, do I like slavery? No. Would I hold slaves? No. Do I think we should break up the Union because some people far away from me have slaves? No. Right? But then the question becomes different when suddenly, well, wait a minute, they're taking a person from my community and they're marching him down the street at gunpoint. Well, now I no longer feel like I can just see this as an abstraction. This is something that affects me, and I feel like I have lost the ability to govern, to be invested in my own in the political project and the civic life of my community, because this kind of question has been taken away from me and federalized. Right? And so that becomes a question of people feeling disempowered, which is part of what drives political activation. And so I think that really does, that's part of one way of understanding, I think, how political activation works, whether you want to call it radicalization or simply sort of political change, political how one's politics change over time. I think that's one way of understanding, if you want to ask the question, what happened to Bill Kristol? Something like this has happened to Bill Kristol, right? Who used to be a conservative and now is sort of one of the main critiques of what's happening in the federal government today. He's had some kind of change in the way that he feels about how much government is representing him. And I think that I think is about democracy. It's about a certain kind of baseline sense that we should be able to be controlling or have some say in how we're governed. And I do think that that matters. And I think we can talk about that. I think if we want to talk about whether we like are Rawlsian or Kantian, that stuff, maybe that doesn't get us anywhere, right? Or if we want to talk about whose view of constitutional democracy, or is it a democracy or a republic, maybe that stuff is too abstract and not really useful to us. But I do think we can talk about how we are civically engaged and why that matters, because I think that does matter to people ultimately at a kind of baseline level of their daily experience.
Switching back to the 1850s, was work being done to connect what was literally in front of people's faces and the larger legal decisions going on behind the scenes?
Absolutely. Let me say a couple things about the yes. So one is just to observe that there was a huge outpouring of anti-slavery literature, both fictional and non-fictional, in the 1840s and 50s. So Frederick Douglass's narrative is probably the most famous of these, but maybe the second most famous, or equally most famous, or maybe more famous, is Uncle Tom's Cabin. Right. So one way of describing both of those books and the many other books like them that also came out, and many other kinds of things like them that were coming out at the time, was a way of trying to draw people from the abstraction of slavery as a thing happening in the world into something more like a personal understanding of the system and the institution, and the way that the institution was inscribed in culture and law. Right. So the big, one of the reasons why Uncle Tom's Cabin was so effective as a political document in changing people's minds was because it created a different kind of relationship to the institution of slavery for people reading the book who maybe had never had any experience on a plantation or with a person who had been enslaved. And so it created a different kind of politics through a changed perspective, right? The second thing I want to say is that one of the things that many of the lawyers that I write about in the 1850s were doing was experimenting with different kinds of writing, including novels, some extremely mediocre novels I would mention that I've had to read and write about, but they're trying to do a thing which is precisely what you're describing, trying to tell a story to the broader world about what's happening. And they're finding that it's inadequate to simply make that argument in court or write an op-ed. So they're writing books, they're writing histories, they're writing diatribes and manifestos and all kinds of things. There's a huge outpouring of literature that is sort of aimed at precisely what you're saying, people trying to draw connections for the public. And that ultimately, I think a lot of what you see is that you see the groundwork of that being laid, and then all of a sudden there's a fugitive slave law case in your town. And that thing that you might have read about, you might have read this thing, and all of a sudden it happens down the street from you. And the switch flips for you, and you become sort of, from apathetic or maybe even supportive of slavery, you become opposed to it. So I didn't mention this, but in 1854, after the same thing that radicalizes Thoreau and in some ways Whitman, there's a very famous Amos Lawrence, who is rich textile magnate, winds up becoming radicalized by the same moment. And his famous quote, and I may somewhat mess it up, but I think this is basically, we went to bed old-fashioned cotton wigs, and we waked up stark mad abolitionists, right? And so Amos Lawrence then goes on to bankroll John Brown and get the city of Lawrence, Kansas named after him. He becomes radicalized in this moment, and it didn't just happen because he was watching Anthony Burns on the street. It happened because he'd also been reading these things, and the things are in the culture, and this groundwork is being laid. And I think there's similar stories that you could tell in the present about the way in which, to the extent people are having political shifts and political consciousness is changing, it's not changing all because of just what's happening right now. It's changing because of longer term efforts to try to tell stories about the systems that we operate within and the ways in which they might or might not be beneficial to us or beneficial to the project of self-government, right? There's another aspect of this which I think is also relevant to the present reality of people, to the extent that people are going into the streets. I think sometimes people think of protests or people sort of public manifestations of resistance as being somehow spontaneous, right? Just, oh, all of a sudden people got angry and they went into the streets. That's never how it works. There are pre-existing structures of solidarity, organization, whether that's labor, whether it's pre-existing community organizing, whether it's farm workers organizing, whether it's tenants organizing. There are a bunch, whether it's churches, right? There's 1,000 ways in which people are already in community with each other. And usually when you see any kind of solidaristic or mass movement of people on the left or the right, by the way, what you're seeing is an activation of pre-existing structures. Yes, in spontaneous response to things. Absolutely. I'm not saying that people aren't responding to current events, but that it's a mistake to think that these things happen spontaneously somehow out of sort of like some sort of zeitgeist, right? They're usually coming from pre-existing structures of people who've been doing work to build those kinds of structures of solidarity and networks. And then that work changes when events call for it. But it does. I just do think I think there's a similarity there too. That it's not just that you're priming the pump in a sort of broader cultural way, but actually we need to be recognizing that the kind of political work that I'm talking about, of slow, incremental building of power, so that we can have a world that we are happy with, or building towards something like that, is something that's already happening, and it doesn't happen sort of just because people are mad about something. It sometimes that can amplify it, but I don't think that the best way of understanding it is as continuous with a much longer story that's happening over a longer time arc.
Before turning to contemporary events in Los Angeles and then also what you see in the classroom and in one of your communities, I wanted to bring up Reconstruction. So if you can look at the existing world and say, gosh, this is reminding me a little bit of, or a fair amount, about 1850, where does Reconstruction fit into that?
It's a great question. I will admit to having a part of me that is sympathetic with the sort of simplest version of the answer, which is that Reconstruction ended way too early, and the political will for behind Reconstruction was tragically insufficient to finishing the project. And in fact, I am writing a little bit about this now, and really believe that one mistake we make about Reconstruction is thinking of Reconstruction and the Reconstruction Amendments as somehow a heroic high point, when in fact part of the problem was that there were real radical ideas that were put forward during Reconstruction that would have actually transformed the political landscape of the country more than the Reconstruction Amendments wound up transforming them, and they were rejected in favor of ultimately a compromise position. So that, the most sort of simplistic way of saying this is that John Bingham, who is sometimes seen as the Madison of the Reconstruction Amendments, was actually a moderate, and he was a compromiser. And so the 14th Amendment was written not as a sort of radical high point of egalitarianism, but as a compromise with people like Thaddeus Stevens and Frederick Douglass and others, and Wendell Phillips, who were arguing for something much more expansive during Reconstruction. So do I think that if that had happened, we'd be in a better position? Yes, I think so. Although I guess I would say something else which goes against that point, which is that, so I write a lot about Reconstruction. I've also written about redemption, which is the period after Reconstruction. And the simplest way of understanding what redemption was a massive backlash of reactionary white supremacy politics against Reconstruction. And a backlash that was not necessarily avoidable by simply having written a better 14th Amendment. I mean, in some ways it could have been, right? We can argue about the counterfactuals in lots of ways. If you actually had done land redistribution, you might have broken up some of the political power of the planter class. And so, yes, maybe. But also, I think one thing we've seen over time in this country is the resilience of a reactionary white supremacist politics as a part of a long story of American political life. And so it does seem a little reductionist to me to imagine that we could have killed that then and there. That was the moment to kill this thing which has been part of our political life for as long as we've had a nation. Somehow, if we'd only done Reconstruction a little better, we would have been able to kill this force. I just think that seems a little implausible to me, as I sort of play it out. And so, do I think that Reconstruction is a heroic story? No. Do I think that much more could have been done in that moment of political possibility? Absolutely. But I will return to a thing I've already talked about, which is that the thing that I find most inspiring about Reconstruction is not the actual substantive outcomes that came from the Reconstruction Amendments, but rather the kind of flowering of political possibility that happened in this moment, basically between 1860 and 1870, when people were imagining, what would we do differently? How could we organize ourselves in such a way that we could create a society that reflected our values better? Right. And that is actually something that's not a permanent solution to anything. That's a process solution. That's creating the context for a kind of thicker politics that could be doing that kind of imagining on a more regular basis. And that to me seems like it's something that we could be seeking to look back to. And we could be saying, we want more of that kind of politics out in the world, because that kind of politics allows us to build things in a more iterative way. I think it's a mistake to imagine that somehow that we will defeat the political forces we disagree with simply by having one better law that we make this one time. We'll abolish the Senate and everything will be fixed. I don't think it works that way. We need to engage in a long-term political project that is in service of the things we believe in, right? And so, and I think one way of sort of oversimplifying this is to think, well, there is a long-term political movement of sort of nativism and white supremacy in this country. And after Reconstruction, it was explicitly called white supremacy. And during Jim Crow, it was explicitly called white supremacy. And as Jim Crow was breaking up, people like George Wallace were explicitly calling it white supremacy. And some people in the present are explicitly calling it white supremacy. It's a long-term, continuous political project. And there's also a long-term, continuous political project in this country in service of multiracial, inclusive, participatory democracy. And those two projects are at odds with each other, right? And I think one of the problems that people who disagree with the white supremacist project have faced is that there was a fiction that somehow in the last 50 years, we'd all agreed that multiracial democracy was what we were doing, that somehow we'd had a victory of multiracial democracy. And I think that's not true. I think that what we need and what we've always needed is an activated and sort of conscious political project in support of that long-term set of principles that are about inclusionary multiracial democracy. And that needs to be engaged against the sort of long-term forces that push back against that, right? And so I think to the extent that Reconstruction represents a moment of the real organization and flourishing of that kind of political imagination, we should go back and build from it. To the extent that we want to say somehow like we just wrote the 14th Amendment wrong, and if we'd written it better, we'd have a better outcome. And that seems it's fantasy in the first place, and I'm not sure it does anything for us in the second place. I think understanding ourselves as engaged in something that is building something now is more useful than trying to reclaim something that never happened in the past.
The idea of creating the context for something, I think, is important. That's usually how I frame this struggle for a democratic political system or a democratic republic, changing the existing institutions, rules, so on and so forth, is working towards creating the context through which more things can happen. So I think it's important, just in general, the point you make, to appreciate how it's often not a question of you sort of get rid of this and then for certain immediately this thing happens. More perhaps seeing how changing something can create new environments in which new things can happen, so on and so forth. I wanted to close with two questions. The first one has to do with your teaching of constitutional law. And so there was an early 2024 article on the New York Times talks about the crisis of teaching constitutional law. And I wanted to quote a bit. The author writes that courses on constitutional law are, and this is their quote, based on an underlying premise that has long bound together everyone involved in the project of training the next generation of lawyers. That premise being that the Supreme Court is a legitimate institution of government, and the 9 justices, whatever their political backgrounds, care about getting the law right. They're more interested in upholding fundamental democratic principles, and most importantly, preserving the court's integrity, so on and so forth. The author concludes the premise no longer holds today. So I'm not as interested in just how this question attaches to the Supreme Court, although the Supreme Court is perhaps a big part of this, but these institutions in general, the Constitution in general. And I will just say I've talked to some law professors who say they don't like this article and that they don't feel like really anything has changed, that the tasks sort of remain the same. And I've talked with people who feel that the tasks have changed and so on and so forth. So curious how you see this, what you're experiencing.
I think there's a really interesting article that I both think is very valuable and also I think has some problems in it. I won't go too deep into the weeds of sort of the constitutional law professors back and forth about this article, but I will say that I think it was describing a sort of, as a cultural matter, a true thing in the legal academy, which was this kind of late 20th century, early 21st century belief in some kind of stability or some kind of agreed legitimacy. I think there's always been, however, a relatively large minority of us teaching the class differently. And this is to the extent that maybe I'll just align myself with the professors you've talked to who said things haven't changed very much, which is people who have been teaching the class as more of a story of American constitutional law, which doesn't necessarily rely on the underlying premise that the Supreme Court is legitimate, but rather studies the way in which legitimacy has been invented, performed, and how it works, right? Of course, it's the case that the Supreme Court's decisions do matter a great deal, and that its legitimacy, whatever it draws on, whether it's real or not, has force. So, for instance, before Dobbs, there were real restrictions on the kinds of limitations that say it's good put on abortion rights, and after Dobbs, there aren't, right? And so, and this is just pure legal realism, I suppose, but there's just an observation that the court does have legitimacy and power. And that the way to teach the class, as I've always seen it, is to try to teach my students how to understand that, how it works in the world, and how to understand how that's related to the way in which things have changed over time. And not to pretend as if politics doesn't matter, but also not to pretend as if politics is the only thing that matters. Because in fact, that's not a very good way of understanding what's going on with the court either, right? The court has a set of institutional practices and rules that it's developed over time that constrain it or at least guide it in certain ways, right? And so the project of the class, which I think more broadly speaking is a kind of figure for the project of teaching lawyers, is to observe there's a thing out in the world which is the law as written, and then there's the world, right? And the law as written only matters insofar as it affects the world, and the world, of course, affects the law as written. And lawyers are the people who stand between those two poles. Lawyers are the mediators in many ways of how the law impacts the world and how the world impacts the law. And understanding the project of trading lawyers is understanding the project of training people to be mediators in that situation. And so somehow pretending as if the law is only a set of systems that we have no control over doesn't train you very well to be a lawyer, because if you imagine you have no control, you're going to be a poor mediator. But it also doesn't help you very much to just imagine that the law is just nothing and that it's all acts of will, because that's going to make you a bad lawyer too, because you're going to be constrained in all kinds of ways by procedural rules and by the language that the court will choose to observe and not observe. So it matters. The task of learning this stuff is a task of learning how to mediate between the sort of ideal that the law, constitutional law, means something, and constitutional law means nothing, and that it's all politics or it's all law. It's actually a mess. And that's how it's always been. I think the mess is in some ways more visible now because of a greater visibility of some of the ways in which the court's legitimacy is not as strong as it might have seemed previously. A breakdown of decorum in lots of ways, a sort of more explicit set of political projects being enacted on the court. But I don't think that it's fundamentally changed, because I think ultimately we're still talking about the same thing, which is that the court is an institution in the world that has and mediates power. And lawyers have to learn how to operate within that institution. And the institution changes over time the way all institutions change. And so the task of the class is teaching people how to understand the institution and then operate within and around it. So yes, that's a long way of saying I do think things have changed in the sense that people don't view law as neutral in the same way that they might have at the end of the 20th century. People understand that many more things are up for grabs, and the institutions that had seemed stable are not as stable as they'd seemed. But that doesn't mean the institutions aren't there, and it doesn't mean that law doesn't exist, and it doesn't mean that lawyers don't have roles mediating between law and the world, and translating and trying to do things with their knowledge. And that's what we're ultimately working on. A professor who teaches it that way is teaching a certain kind of background ideology also, right? There's no such thing as just the facts, ma'am, when we're talking about a profession which is rooted in persuasion, argument, and growth, right? Just the facts, ma'am, is not a actually particularly useful way of advocating for your client if you're trying to win in court, right? So the illusion of some sort of abstract reality that is out, that doesn't have an ideology behind it, I think, generally speaking, doesn't make a lot of sense. Everybody teaches from their own perspective, and our students then build their own perspectives, not parroting our perspectives, but rather through the experience of experiencing different people's voices and different perspectives, and then learning how to build their own set of capacities and understanding.
So the earlier discussion we were having about people being taken off the streets, disappeared, taken from their communities, the community resisting in some sense, I'll just open it up to how you've been viewing the ongoing protests in Los Angeles, the narrative that the Trump administration has been putting out around it, perhaps the narrative that the government of California has been putting out around it, and just what's going on.
It's a little hard to talk about because it's happening now, and hard to talk about because I'm not there. I'm always skeptical of people looking from afar at a situation where there are complex and detailed nuances about what's happening on the ground that I just literally don't have any knowledge of. One thing that has struck me as I've been watching, as I've been following from afar, is the way in which we have this dissonance between past romanticized moments of resistance and present moments of resistance. So, the most famous of these, well, maybe one of the most famous of these is, the Boston Tea Party or the Boston Massacre, both moments of these sort of foundational moments of lore in our national story of who we are. The Boston Tea Party was an act of mass, organized, property destruction. The Boston Massacre was a bunch of troops of the sovereign shooting protesters in the streets, right? We look back and we know who the good guys are and the bad guys are in that situation, right? Similarly, we generally know who the good guys are and the bad guys are in the situation of should there have been federal troops marching Anthony Burns through the streets in Boston, right? We've told a story that the abolitionists were the good guys. It's sort of a foundational story that the abolitionists were the good guys. Although I don't think I think one of the things about our current politics is that there are many people who don't accept that narrative that the abolitionists were the good guys. Similarly, we tend to know, as between Martin Luther King and Bull Connor, who the good guys were. When we look through that lens, and this is just in the domestic context, we could also tell the story of Tiananmen Square. We could tell the story of all kinds of things happening all over the world. When we look through that lens, it does make it a little hard to understand the through line that some people in the administration are drawing between American values and what's happening in the street. So that is an observation I will make just as a historical matter, that by and large, the narrative we tell about our what role protests and resistance have played in our national culture building suggests certain roles for certain people in these moments, right? The other thing I'll say is that I do think that this wouldn't be happening if people weren't having moments of visceral outrage that are similar to the ones that I talk about in the 1850s. Moments of political conversion, moments of visceral outrage, moments of real sort of questioning of certain kinds of things and roles in the world. So for instance, just a couple of years ago when people said abolish ICE, there was sort of broad political tutting about it. And now the same is, not to pick on, Bill Kristol, but like basically Bill Kristol's tweeting out abolish ICE, right? So something has changed in our politics that is about people's experience of what's going on in the world, right? I think in some ways we can get into the questions of what is the right way of protesting, or what are the ways in which the state's use of violence are problematic, and those are interesting questions. As a historian, I'm most interested in the ways in which the sort of tectonic movements underneath the surface look familiar to me. And they look familiar to me in the sense that people's minds are changing and people are being politically activated in ways they hadn't been politically activated before. And that has consequences, the consequences that are destabilizing. I think it's a mistake to pretend that the protests are not destabilizing, right? That's actually part of what the point of any protest is. But that because that's happening, there are ways in which we can understand the directionality of that kind of political change, and that these are both a cause of more political change, but also a symptom of ongoing change happening in our political and legal culture. So to me, that's what's most interesting about them. And I recognize that's a little bit of a, academic's answer. But as someone who was formerly worked with movement folks, I do feel some reticence about jumping in on any of the questions of like, how are the protests, how should they be going? Many of the things about what's going on the ground, I feel quite inclined to be to hold my tongue about, because I just don't know. I do think what's most interesting, though, is the way in which, if you look at the longer story of this kind of political awakening and this kind of political reaction in this country, it's pretty clear to see some of those narratives and how they play out, and it shouldn't be surprising that some of this is happening, given the kinds of political brutality that we're seeing enacted by the government. It's not surprising to see this kind of reaction, because that's how it's happened in the past. I am ultimately, and maybe this is just my predisposition, an optimist. As I look in the future, I'm seeing more possibility for us to build a society that I think is kinder and more just and better. I think that the things that are happening today are both destabilizing, but also create a kind of almost a founding moment, a moment of imagination, a moment of possibility for doing things that maybe in a more stable system are harder to do. So I do feel optimistic about that. And I think that part of that requires a kind of political awakening, right? And part of one of the things that comes with political awakening is protest, or is reaction to things that are happening on the ground. So to that extent, I think if we're talking about building something that we all want, then I think seeing things in motion is better than seeing things not in motion. But again, I do think there are lessons to be drawn from history about strategy. I just don't think that I don't think that anybody from afar can know about what strategy lessons are or aren't being drawn. And by and large, uh, having worked with a bunch of movement organizers in my past life, I tend to trust them on questions of strategy more than I would trust myself about them. So, and my broader point is that I do think that there are larger stories that can put the story we're seeing in context, and that people being politically activated is better than people not being politically activated. On all sides, by the way, on all political sides. I don't mean this as like a both sides issue, but I do actually think political activization is good as a general baseline good. And so to the extent that there's more of that happening and we're having those conversations, that's better. And it's a source of optimism.
Well, Dan, I really appreciate you coming on and talking about these issues, from your work around the 1850s and abolition to what it means to be a teacher and a lawyer and operating in these various spaces, to Bernie Sanders and the Senate, to current events in Los Angeles. It's been a wide-ranging conversation, and I've enjoyed how at each point you've brought the conversation back towards what you've seen in history, particularly around this 1850s abolitionist period. And it'll be interesting to see, I think, well, as we talked about, as things feel less stable, as more questions are asked, I think people will be inevitably looking to history to draw lessons. And so I think your work is particularly important.
Well, thanks. It's been a total pleasure, and I've enjoyed it.